Guys, I know it's really early right now, but Xbox just announced a bunch of stuff, so we gotta talk about it. I think one of my favorite responses I've seen on Twitter so far is someone just commenting on the fact that Xbox has effectively brought back memory cards. It's no secret that a lot of major events have been canceled right now. E3 is gone, GDC didn't happen, there are a lot of gaming-focused announcement times that have just simply passed us by. So in response to that, Microsoft has gone ahead and just out of nowhere released a lot of new information about the Xbox Series X. So let's take a look at a lot of the information they've released and kind of break it down into its parts. First, the big thing they talked about was the power of the system, focusing on the tech behind it. Now, this is something that Microsoft has touched on a little bit in the past, but it's all been very broad terms before. Oh, it's going to have an SSD. It's going to have 12 teraflops. It's going to have... They've just kind of been using terms in the past, and now we actually have some very specific tech specs available, which I'm not going to try and memorize off the top of my head, so let's read some tech specs. The CPU inside the Series X is going to be a custom Zen 2 CPU that's going to have 8 cores clocked at 3.8 gigahertz. Meanwhile, the GPU is going to be a custom RDNA 2, which comes from AMD and is basically the latest style of card they can make. It's going to be capable of 12 teraflops and is making use of 52 compute units clocked at 1.825 gigahertz. If all that sounds like jargon to you, by the way, the real simple takeaway that I think is important to focus on is that the Xbox Series X GPU is capable of 12 teraflops, which is just an easy shorthand way of measuring basically the kind of graphical power of the system, while the Xbox One X, their current high-power system, has 6 teraflops. So the Series X is double that. For memory, the Series X will be making use of 16 gigabytes of GDDR6. That is 4 more gigs than the Xbox One X, and it is a newer version of RAM compared to the One X's GDDR5. And for storage, this is the big thing that's been talked about a lot and theorized by a few people. Of course, they've talked a lot about the fact that they're using an SSD. Specifically, though, for size, it's going to be coming with 1 terabyte. Now, of course, with any kind of system when this comes out, that's always subject to change as time goes by. There could be larger, better models made available in the future. But as of right now, the stock standard Series X is coming with a 1 terabyte SSD. We'll focus on this a little later, but if you're wondering why that's effectively sounding like the same size as a lot of common systems right now, including the current One X, well, even though some games are going to be getting larger and that kind of thing, an SSD is a different kind of storage system than the hard drives that the Xbox One X and Xbox One S make use of. The important difference is that while it's carrying the same amount of data in this situation, it's going to be able to load up all that stuff way, way, way faster. One of the most interesting bits that the tech specs revealed, though, was the use for the mystery port. So if you guys have seen any of the early leaks of the Series X, there was this mysterious port on the back of it that was just this long, thin one with a symbol next to it. Well, we now know that's going to be used for expandable storage. Microsoft will be releasing proprietary designs made by Seagate, which are expandable storage for the Series X with memory cards, basically, that are 1 terabyte in size. Now, the cool thing about these is that they will work the same way as the internal storage of the Series X. So anything that you install and load on this expandable memory card is going to load and work just as fast as something that was installed on the main hard drive of the system. Now, the system will still support more traditional versions of external storage. You can hook up an external SSD or hard drive to it using a 3.2 USB port. That stuff's not going to load up as fast as that custom expandable storage can, but that is an option if you want even more storage, or you'd rather go that route because you already have an external SSD and you don't necessarily want to buy a proprietary memory card. And to top all that off, just some real simple takeaways. The system does, of course, have an optical drive because we've seen the disk slot for it. It will support 4K UHD Blu-rays, and the target performance for the system is 4K resolution, 60 frames, potentially going as high as 120 frames. Now, something important I want to kind of highlight real quick when we talk about that target frame rate is that I feel like 4K 60 is going to be a little more the standard for new games coming out. When they talk about the potential of 100 or 120 FPS, that's a little more aimed at stuff that's currently not pushing the boundaries of what the system is capable of. A really good example of this is that they did a couple tech demos with games like Gears 5. And in the case of Gears 5, which is an Xbox One X game, they were hitting 4K 100 FPS. They did talk about trying to leverage a little more power here and there and fine-tune it more to get to 120 FPS, but for the time being, that's what the system was capable of, which is still insanely good. Listed aside from all the tech specs, one other thing that was mentioned that is very important and has been one of the kind of hot topics of upcoming generations. Every major generation has a keyword people like to use, whether it's, oh, this is an HD system, this is a 4K system, this one can use HDR. The new one, and it is, I don't want to underplay that this is actually not a cool thing, it is important, it does have hardware accelerated ray tracing. What that means is it makes use of technology that allows games to, in real time, simulate the ways that light and sound work, and it creates a much more realistic looking environment compared to the kind of things that we've seen in a lot of games lately. Of course, all this power inside the Series X means a lot of heat is going to be generated. So another thing they emphasized in separate press releases was all the various bits of cooling tech they're making use for the system, including the fact that the tower design itself is actually one gigantic fan vent design where it's sucking air in through the bottom and pushing it out the top. And on top of that, they'll also be making use of a split motherboard, which will help separate the heat out a little more and spread it, as opposed to being all focused in one main area. It's actually really funny if you go to their main website right now that's showing off the Series X, there's like 5 different pictures just focusing on the ways the system is going to try and keep cool, which is important because as long as it maintains a nice solid temperature, that's going to make sure that you're able to make use of the full power of the system and maintain things like those target goals of 4K 60 gameplay. Now, the second big pillar they wanted to focus on is speed, and a large part of that is that thing we already talked about involving the fact that they are now making use of SSDs, which should very heavily improve loading times just to begin with. But to top that off, an extra thing they talked about is a new thing they're calling Xbox Velocity Architecture. This is a new method of how they're working with the system that interfaces the SSD to the system and is supposed to heavily prioritize and improve the way that it loads assets for games. One of the main ways they really focused on the benefits of this is for things like open world games. They dropped some specific names like Final Fantasy 15, Red Dead Redemption 2. The idea being that in those games, it's really taxing on the system sometimes to try and make sure that it's always loading assets in time to make sure the world is always seeming like this seamless moving thing and you never run into a situation where all of a sudden it just stops and has to load stuff. Well, Xbox Velocity Architecture is meant to help improve those kind of situations and make sure that you're always going to have a thoroughly immersive experience in these big open world games. Simple version, SSDs are already faster than hard drives. Xbox Velocity Architecture is making sure that it's really making full use of that speed and loading the right stuff at the right speed necessary. One other tangent on the concept of speed that's a little different, but I really appreciate them going into, is the focus on input latency. One of the things that a lot of people sometimes have to figure out on their own is how to get the lowest latency possible on their games, whether that's adjusting the settings on their monitor, sometimes even plugging a controller in. Well, one of the things that Microsoft wants to emphasize with the Series X is making sure that right out of the gate, the system is giving you the lowest latency possible. This is including making use of a new connection style between their new controller and the Series X, which should have a lower latency than past systems, but also making use of new features on their HDMI out, including support for 120 Hz, variable refresh rate, and auto low latency modes. While not directly a part of the Series X itself, Microsoft also went out of the way to mention that they are working with a lot of different major TV manufacturers right now to make sure that a lot of new modern ones are going to properly leverage all these features. This is something they've already done a little bit in the past. For instance, with Samsung, there was a TV line they focused on that was going to be one of the first ones to use FreeSync, which the Xbox One X was making use of. So kind of in that similar vein, they're going to be working with other TV manufacturers to make sure that all the new stuff coming out is going to fully leverage what the Series X can take advantage of. One last thing they talked about on the concept of speed, which we do already know about, is the quick resume feature. So on current systems, whenever you suspend a game, you suspend one game. You can swap between that game and a media service, like going to Netflix or something, but that's it. With the Series X, you're going to be capable of suspending multiple games at a time and immediately resuming wherever you left off. So if you want to play a couple rounds in your favorite shooter, but then switch over to a single player game, but then also switch over to a rhythm game, well, good news. As soon as you suspend any of those, you can go back to them and resume right where you left off in each and every single one of them, not having to only have one instance running at a time. The last pillar they talked about is something that we already kind of know about the Series X, but I'm really glad that they are heavily re-emphasizing this time and time again because it's very important to me, and that's the concept of compatibility on the system, making sure that things they've already released and already done for past ones still work moving forward on the One X. And they're really trying to do some interesting things with this. One aspect they've talked about before is the concept of Xbox Smart Delivery, where if you own a copy of a game on some particular system, they're still going to be able to deliver you the best experience possible, even if you're using a different system. So for instance, if you own Gears 5 on Xbox One X, well, when you get the Series X, one of the cool benefits is they're going to include giving you the Series X version of Gears 5 right away, so you get that version of the game with all those performance boosts instead of having to just rebuy the title. This also works going backward in the sense of games that don't necessarily have a Series X version. You're still going to be able to make use of backwards compatibility like on the Xbox One, going back to 360 and even all the way back to original Xbox, and playing those little games while getting the benefits of a more powerful system, whether that's giving you more stable frame rates, faster loading times, higher resolutions, and maybe some additional post-processing features that make the game look even better than it did when it first came out. One other little interesting tidbit they dropped real quick in this section that was cool is the concept of cross-generational multiplayer. Basically, if you're playing a multiplayer game on the Series X and you want to play with your friend that only has a 1X, well, good news, you guys can still play together on the same servers, even though you're getting probably a much more beautiful experience. So that's it. That's a lot of information dropped out of nowhere early Monday morning, but we now know pretty much just about everything about the Xbox Series X outside of pricing, release date, and obviously more new game announcements for it. We know about Halo Infinite, but that's currently about it. So while there are still some more things I would like to learn as far as the core system itself goes, that's it. And it's a lot to process right now. Honestly, I am really excited about a lot of the technology and stuff they are talking about in this system. I think the next step really is just finding out what that price is, because I think that's the big hanging question for a lot of people is, yeah, this sounds really cool, but what is it going to cost me? And then ultimately, of course, the big question is, what is it going to cost you relative to their main competitor, PlayStation, with the PS5? Now, again, Sony has been very, very, very quiet compared to Xbox. We know next to nothing about the PS5 compared to what we now know about the Series X. Whether or not that is a strength or weakness for PlayStation, we'll learn later, but right now, Microsoft has definitely been building up a lot of hype for this next-gen system. The only thing we're theorizing about, I think, right now for Xbox is the possibility of that cheaper version of the system, which a lot of people are dubbing as Xbox Series S, also known as Project Lockhart. There is still some time before the Series X comes out, so it's possible something like that could get announced and released simultaneously, but as we draw closer, I'm leaning more towards the theory that we're going to get Series X this holiday season, and then Series S possibly the following year for anyone that didn't want to dish out the full price for the maximum power Series X. So let me know what you guys think. Are you excited for the Series X? Were you previously Team PlayStation and now this has changed your mind? Have you not changed your mind yet? That's a lot of new news. So let me know what you guys think.